what do you think is the most under-addressed issue in tall building design, development, management, and how would you address it? Something that's not being talked about or not being talked about enough or in the right way.
I think we had a conversation with some of the colleagues from this organization just a few minutes ago about an issue which is I think a very important issue with tall building design is when does a tall building end? Short buildings have a sort of known life, and it's when the real estate values overcome the value of the building, and then you're better off using that land for something else. Tall buildings are more difficult to remove. I don't think we've ever removed one intentionally yet. So I think that issue is an interesting issue for discussion. Every building has a lifespan. Nothing's infinite. Tall buildings obviously have a long lifespan, but it is finite.
And the issue is figuring out when that is, or the demolition of it, or
and
what comes
how do you
next?
do a tall building removal in an urban, tight environment? It could be incredibly expensive.
What tall building project do you most admire, and how would you emulate that, or what aspects of that do you think should be more common, or what's something about a project that you admire but would change and improve upon?
Living in New York, I always admired the Chrysler Building. It's interesting when you look at the skyline of any major city, one always goes to the highest building. But with the Chrysler Building, for some reason, whenever I go into Manhattan, I see the top of that building. Whether it be the shape or how it's illuminated at night, for me, it always stands out. The challenge in doing buildings like that in today's time is that, you use that building as an example, it's 77 stories tall. But the top 6 stories or so are not occupied. And in most buildings today, developers want to get every ounce of opportunity in terms of rental out of their real estate. So, it's a balance between doing good architecture and spending money where one may not get a return on it. But I think that's a very great example, at least in Manhattan, in terms of a terrific high-rise office building.
So that iconic Art Deco flourish at the top wouldn't really work if you had apartment floors in there, probably.
Well, you probably could, but the original design didn't include that at its time.
We're also asking a lot of people about an interesting trend. Do you think wood will become a primary tall building material within 10 years, and why or why not?
Wood in tall buildings is an interesting conversation. When one looks at wood, look at sawdust. It was always seen as waste. Now it's seen as a valuable product because it's used for glulam beams. Most wood structures are really designed in the 6 to possibly 8 story category. But there are many studies happening now around the globe. I know there's studies happening in Canada, there are studies happening in Australia that look at the opportunities for wood and how it can be achieved in a higher building. One, it's very sustainable. It creates less water pollution, it creates less air pollution, and requires less energy than steel or concrete. When wood actually burns, it chars, and it doesn't always collapse right away. When steel burns, it melts, and it starts to deform. Do I think it would be in every structure? No, because I think we need a balance, and one wouldn't want to destroy the woodlands that we have if every building was wood. But I think we're getting to a point where now we're looking to achieve higher structures based on the research that I've seen.
So 10 years, what do you think? How much?
10 years may be a stretch, but I think a lot of things that happened in the last couple of years. Look at long span joists, for example. They were always done in structural steel members. Now most residential projects at a low-rise basis are using wood joists because of the long spans that we can achieve. So I think if we can take that technology and somewhat deal with that in a more vertical fashion, I think that's a good thing.
Let me,
Sure.
if I may, I do feel that we humans have abused our privileges very often on natural products, thinking that they're infinite, and that if wood were to become very popular as a tall building material, I have no doubts that wood would go the same way as it did when it was being used as charcoal or being used as firewood, and that there would be a significant impact. So I think it's a great idea. I think it has an appeal because it's very rare that a wood building is being proposed now. If it were to become more feasible, if it were to become marketable, we'd have to watch out for our forests, because we've seen all of our forests, the entire Northeast, disappear with fireplaces, and so it could go the same direction.
Not without its own environmental risks. Sure.
Exactly.
What do you think should be done with the massive stock of mid-century office buildings primarily, or just the massive stock of outmoded buildings that we find ourselves dealing with, especially when it comes to energy efficiency?
Well, we just had a conversation about that earlier in terms of how does one look at mid-century buildings. The reality is that the marketplace is actually looking at those buildings as prime real estate. And why is that? Predominantly because they have higher floor-to-floor heights in many cases, yet at the same time they have much larger footprints. A lot of those buildings were built when the codes were a little different, and as a result of that, one needs to look at how we can revitalize those buildings and make them more marketable, because when you look at the client base in cities like Chicago and New York, in terms of the end users, those users want more flexible environment. They want a lot of light, and they want opportunities to go into buildings that may not have ceilings in them, so a lot of the infrastructure can be exposed. So I think a lot of those mid-century buildings are ripe for being retooled to respond to that demand.
If I may, I totally agree, and for a somewhat different reason. I have my background is the preservation movement, and that's why I was working on the UN. And I do feel that the preservation movement has to move beyond iconic buildings and heritage buildings and significant buildings and move to the run-of-the-mill 30-story, 20-story. All buildings need to be considered for recycling because they do incorporate tremendous embodied energy. There's a significant investment in energy of doing the foundations, getting those bricks, building that steel frame, whatever it is. There's a lot of energy already invested, which gets thrown away in demolition. So I do feel that we cannot afford as a society to continue to throw away that energy and invest the new energy involved in building a new building every time that a client wants a new building. I think the architect's role needs to be an advocate for recycling buildings, just like tin cans. They need to be, buildings need to be, and not just beautiful buildings and special buildings where treaties were signed, but buildings just need to be recycled.
Do you think clients are more receptive to that line of thinking than they used to be, or is it still an uphill battle?
I think as we get more tornadoes and hurricanes, and as the ocean rises, everyone will become more receptive to finding ways. We all need to put that in our toolbox. It's not the end all, but it has to be in our toolbox.
Let's talk about the UN building. Can you tell us just really briefly about the history and the project itself? But also, I want to know, were there any interventions that you considered but ultimately proved too costly, too difficult, or whatever the reason, unfeasible?
You want to talk about the history?
I'll talk about the history, and then John,
Sure.
you can talk about our interventions. But I do feel that the project has been well overdue. It has not been renovated since it was built, 1952, 51, and it's because the UN has a growing mandate to spend its money in places where there's poverty or earthquake or warfare or all the things that the UN does. So it's never had the opportunity to recycle, to do a thorough house cleaning and get asbestos and old infrastructure and unsafe conditions. So this was an opportunity. It was actually Mayor Giuliani came to the UN after 9/11 and said, I am not going to send my firefighters into your house if you have an event, because it's not safe, and it's not up to code. And all buildings, although you're not in New York City, you do rely upon the first responders. So I think that generated the interest in doing a project, and within a few years, there was a motivation to put together $2 billion and do the project.
Well, from a standpoint of what did we look at and what couldn't we do for various reasons, there are a number of levels of items that we looked at. And over the years, we didn't always come up with one answer. There was always multiple solutions to a particular problem. And energy was always on the forefront. And budget was always on the forefront. And how do you blend those two things in a way that we're reducing energy and at the same time not spending a lot of the stakeholders' money to do that? So, as an example, we looked at the skin, and we reduced energy by well over 50% within the overall building. And we did that through an insulated glass assembly. And we did that through, shading on the outside with blinds. We did that through lighting levels that got modulated up and down. We did that through efficient mechanical engineering systems. But we did look at elements such as a double wall assembly on the outside. And that proved to be very costly for a number of reasons, whether it be the imposition of load on the structure or the cost of a double layer glass, when in fact we could achieve something that was more than fine based on what we have in place now. We looked at photovoltaics. We looked at taking advantage of all the spandrel panels and utilizing photovoltaics on the exterior as well as on the roofs. There are many roofs, and there's a lot of land on that piece of real estate. But at the end of the day, it wasn't really a good return on the investment. So there are things like that we responded to that really didn't give us a return. Or an all-air system that provided cooling and heat and return air ductwork. We didn't have a good sandwich in terms of the ceiling to the slab where we can introduce a lot more ductwork. So things like that had a cost associated with them or a constructability issue associated with them where we, through a value engineering process, we came up with the solutions that we did. But yes, there were many things that were looked at.
You mentioned the skin. I wanted to ask about that, but you already answered it. Are there other parts of the design that you find particularly innovative, interesting, applicable maybe to other projects?
Well, when you look at a building that has very low floor-to-floor heights, as this building does, the sandwich between the top of the deck and the ceiling was about 2 foot 11 inches. And there's about 8 inches of structure, which doesn't leave a lot of space for anything else in it. We implemented well over 12 systems within that sandwich. And it's all about how does one be creative about defining space and allocation of space. But at the same time, we looked at systems that can go below, like the dimming systems, where we can take advantage of a building that's that narrow, that can harvest a lot of light and capitalize on reducing the lighting levels based on the amount of light that comes in from the outside. Not many buildings in our time are looking at the exterior window wall and composition with the interior wall as one system. In many cases, they're looking at them as either the exterior or either the interior. And what we looked to do was to blend those two things together. And the end result was a lot of energy savings for the UN.
I think we're almost out of time, but if there's anything either of you'd like to add just about maybe the legacy of the UN project.
I think the issue about protection and blast is becoming far more of a subject that's of interest to corporate America and corporate world as well as to government. The UN, of course, is a target in many ways, and we've had to implement in the renovation many different systems in order to better protect the UN from terrorism and from bad people. And it's incorporated into the design. The glass has certain attributes, and the steel frame that John's firm designed behind the glass has certain attributes that allow us to be reassured that we can withstand a certain level of blast that's acceptable. But I do think that it's a messy world. I think blast has become, and I know from our consultants who do only blast, that it's the corporate world is now looking more and more at safety for their own organizations because everyone has a certain exposure.